Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, tensions in the South China Sea over shrinking fish stocks as Beijing sends out a naval armada to stake its claim. The United States steps up plans to build and deploy more warships to the region. Also this week, responsible capitalism. The investors who got the chief executive of an Australian miner fired after blowing up Aboriginal sites. Plus, the first motor show during the pandemic. We talk to the man behind Volvo's electric brand and ask what damage the pandemic has done to the auto industry. Competition for dwindling fish stock in the disputed South China Sea is increasing tensions. China has sent out an armada of naval vessels to defend its claim to about 80% of the sea. Fishermen from surrounding nations say they've been harassed or rammed by Chinese vessels. Well, countries unable to stand up to Beijing are turning to the US for support, which is deploying more warships to the region to counter the world's biggest naval force. Well, we're going to focus now on overfishing and the damage that is doing to the delicate ecosystem. Fish stock are estimated to have fallen by as much as 95% since the 1950s, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It also estimates catches have fallen by as much as 75% in the last 2 decades. One of the biggest reasons for the depletion of stocks is government subsidies, which allow fishing vessels to stay out longer and travel further than necessary. China handed out $7.2 billion in 2018. Globally, government subsidies to the fishing industry stand at about $35 billion. America's top diplomat Mike Pompeo recently denounced China's territorial claim to waters fished by Filipinos as completely unlawful. The support from the US has been cautiously welcomed by fishermen in the Philippines who say they're being pushed out by the Chinese Navy. Jamala Alandogan reports from the northern Philippines.
Sonny Heroila remembers a time when his catch was far more abundant. That was many years ago, when he says he was still free to fish inside the lagoon of Scarborough Shoal, just a little over 120 nautical miles from his hometown of Masinloc in Zambales province. That was until Chinese Navy warships seized control in 2012.
Wala nang barko sa loob, nasa labas na sila lahat.
Now, we can just avoid the bigger Chinese vessels. We know we are no match against them. We stay far from them.
Government leaders in Beijing claim the South China Sea as theirs, saying it's been part of Chinese territory for thousands of years. And China's military continues to build installations, such as on the Spratly group of islands.
The Trump administration.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the Chinese claims to the South China Sea are completely unlawful. And Washington supports 5 Asian countries, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, to what's been described as their inherent right to exclusive economic zones there. The Philippine Secretary of Defense Delfin Lorenzana supports Pompeo's message to China, and Lorenzana says China should abide by the 2016 ruling when the Philippine government won its case against China at the International Tribunal in The Hague. But Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has repeatedly said that China is a far more powerful country and doesn't want to risk going to war. The U.S.-China dispute is seen by many countries as a conflict between 2 competing superpowers. But geopolitics isn't the issue here in the Philippines. For millions of Filipinos living in coastal communities like this one, food security is at the heart of the South China Sea dispute. Many of the fishermen who sail to Scarborough Shoal sell their catch in local markets like this one.
Fish used to be delivered to us in crates. Now, fishermen just come and bring supplies in pails. It takes about 5 fishermen now for us to have this much to sell, and the price of fish has tripled.
Filipinos here tell us they find it ironic that they live in a country rich in maritime resource, and yet the majority of them can't regularly afford even just a kilo of fish. They welcome the U.S.'s backing with cautious optimism. but they know that help should come from their own government first.
So what does overfishing and China's claims to the South China Sea mean for future catches and tension in the region? Well, to answer this, I'm joined by Tabitha Grace Mallory, the Chief Executive of the China Ocean Institute. Good to have you with us. So is China, first of all, solely responsible for overfishing in the seas?
No, a lot of China's neighbors have big fishing industries, and Japan was the first country to have a large industrial fleet. And the first bilateral agreements in the 1950s in East Asia were to prevent Japanese from fishing in Chinese waters. So now you see the opposite. You see Chinese fishing in Japan's waters or Korea's waters. And then in the South China Sea, Vietnam is a huge fishing nation. If you've ever driven along the Vietnamese coastline at night, it's like looking out on a starry sky to look out on the ocean and see all the lights from the fishing vessels. Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, they're all big fishing nations. And essentially what's happened is the South China Sea was traditionally for centuries available for everybody to use. And we've overlaid this new system of sovereignty through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that has led to people fighting over what belongs to whom. And then if you add the increased populations in the region and new fishing technology, you get overfishing. So China definitely catches the most fish, but they're not the only ones responsible.
So what damage is being done to global fish stocks then, especially with practices like trawling?
Yeah, so probably the most damaging event is the development of the huge industrial fleet. So that started in the mid-20th century. And it was, the start of the modernization era, and people approached fishing the way they approached factory work. So the thinking was that if you added better inputs, like bigger fishing vessels and better technology, you would get more fish as outputs. But natural systems don't work that way. And there's so much we don't know about the oceans, and there's lots of potential for discoveries like new antibiotics and antivirals for marine organisms, but things like trawling, sweep up everything that's on the ocean floor and destroy marine habitats and destroy marine organisms without us even necessarily knowing that they're there. And even non-fishing practices like seabed mining can do that too. So it's important to have a precautionary principle in our approach. So for example, in the Arctic, countries have agreed to a temporary moratorium on commercial fishing in order to better understand the ecosystem there before we just go in and catch everything. But there are other parts of the high seas which belong to no country that need management systems. And another important aspect is the subsidies we provide to the fishing, the large industrial fleets. Those need to be limited.
Well, we'll come to subsidies in a moment, but listening to what you're saying, it sounds like it's a very complex situation. And you've got to wonder whether, when you listen to the US Secretary of Defense talking about how the US must build more naval ships to counter China, is that the best way to deal with the issue? Does that solve all of the problems you've been mentioning?
No, the U.S. Navy is not going to be leaving the South China Sea anytime soon, but the rapid increase in U.S. presence there is just going to escalate things with China, and that's not what we want either. So I think we need to think outside the box in terms of managing our natural resources there. There'll always be hard security issues, but the environmental security issues are also really important for regional food security. And there's a lot more potential for cooperation in this area as well.
What do you make of the argument that perhaps the Chinese approach is different? How much of an issue is the use of debt diplomacy, as it's called, to get access to seas and oceans?
Yeah, so that is a problem in places like Africa, in countries, some of the countries in the Pacific Island nations. And so this is China's distant water fishing fleet, which operates on the high seas and also in the coastal waters or the exclusive economic zones of host countries on the basis of bilateral fisheries access agreements. And so one of the things that China does is it avoids some of the limitations that host countries have on foreign fishing fleets by reflagging their vessels. And there was a recent report that estimated as many as 1,000 fishing vessels are operating this way that are actually owned by the Chinese. And so for comparison's sake, the regular Chinese distant water fishing industry is about 3,000 vessels, maybe a little bit less, but around that. And so earlier this year, China revised its distant water fishing regulations and requires certification now, both from China and the host country, if there's the establishment of a wholly owned or joint venture with the host country, or any reflagging. But this is a great step, and it shows that China recognizes that there's a problem. However, we have to see how well this is going to be enforced. That's a really important issue. And then, in addition to the fishing vessels, there's also an issue with the fish carriers being reflagged to other countries, and those are increasingly shipping fish back to China.
All right. Briefly, how much of a problem are subsidies?
So subsidies are a really important issue because they distort the bottom line for fishing companies, making fishing profitable when it wouldn't be otherwise. And China's not the only one, but it is the world's largest fishery subsidizer. It provided an estimated 21% of the global total fishery subsidies in 2018 and 27% of the world's harmful subsidies. So those are subsidies like fuel subsidies that increase fishing capacity. And, it really shows everyone was paying attention to the fishing fleet around the Chinese fishing fleet around the Galapagos Islands. And 2/3 of that fleet came from Zhejiang province. And it's no surprise that Zhejiang is the province that receives the most subsidies from the Chinese government. So the WTO right now is working out an agreement to discipline fishery subsidies, but China wants to be given special and differentiated treatment as a developing country. And so that's pretty controversial. It's complicated, though, because other industrial fishing countries have also large fleets, and they've just done all their fishing mostly in the past. But it's important that we work out this issue and limit subsidies because it's crucial for our long-term economic and environmental security that we get a deal on that issue.
It's wonderful getting your perspective. Thanks so much, Tabitha.
Thank you for having me.
It's often said management runs businesses to maximize returns for shareholders. Right now, it appears investors are looking for something more than just profits. They're turning to ESGs, or environmental, social and governance metrics. Well, the biggest scalp to fall for breaching those standards has been the chief executive of Australian mining giant Rio Tinto. Initially, the miner fined 3 executives $5 million for their part in the destruction of a 46,000-year-old Aboriginal site in Western Australia. Rio Tinto had received legal permission to demolish the caves back in 2013, but when the archaeological importance of the rock shelters became clear, the company failed to change course. As the pandemic wipes out decades of economic growth and poverty reduction, long-festering inequalities are being exposed. Movements like Black Lives Matter have taken to the streets to air grievances and seek justice. Institutions from Wall Street banks to media companies have acknowledged their shortcomings and are pledging to do more to diversify workforces. Even oil giants like BP and Shell have decided to accelerate the move to green technology. They plan to invest in renewable energy, and Norway's trillion-dollar wealth fund is selling its coal assets. Back in Australia, Aboriginal campaign groups have stepped up campaigns to protect other significant historical sites. Joining me now from Karratha in Western Australia is Peter Jeffries. Peter is the Chief Executive Officer of the Western Australia-based Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation. Good to have you with us. If we could start off by talking about your concern. Why are you concerned about what proposed developments might mean for Australia's first underwater heritage finds?
The significance of the recent underwater find for traditional owners in Murujuga and more broadly across Australia is significant in that it's the first underwater find in Australia. And there were 2 sites located just off the coast here at Murujuga. and the historic treasures date back between 7,000 and 8,500 years ago. But more importantly, it confirms our belief and our history that our people have lived in areas that are now underwater due to the sea level rise.
Rio Tinto CEO, as I'm sure you know, was recently fired because of destruction of the Jukan Gorge. Were you surprised by this move?
No, I think we weren't surprised. With regards to the move. I think it just now puts a little bit of more of an international and a national spotlight on these type of activities that are done by mining companies across Australia, and I think more importantly around the world as well. And it just says to us here in Australia that this unfortunate occurrence or incident shouldn't have occurred, and it just means that we have to be diligent now in ensuring or avoiding these type of incidents in the future.
So I take it you were pleased then, if not surprised. What sort of message do you think that should send to other companies?
Basically, what the message now sends to other companies now is that the world is listening, it's watching, and it's looking at what you are doing in Indigenous countries right across the world now, and it's also, I think, given organisations a little bit of a kick in the backside to now actually sit down and come and conduct meaningful engagement. That encourages valuable partnerships and opportunities. More importantly, I think, not importantly, but also potential mutual beneficial coexistence between traditional owners and industry on country and on our sea country as well.
Does it also have some other good news about shareholders, in the sense that it says they're becoming more socially and environmentally aware now and responsible?
Yes, I think they are. I mean, sharing knowledge for us has been critical in us being able to share our information to provide that better understanding of culture and what role industry needs to play with regards to that meaningful engagement that I just talked about. But it also clearly says to the wider group that basically this type of bad behaviour is not acceptable anymore.
All right, thanks so much. It's been great talking to you. Thanks for your perspective on that.
Thank you.
Now, China is holding the largest trade event since the pandemic began. The Beijing Auto Show opened its doors in the hope of reversing the auto industry's multi-billion-dollar losses. Katrina Yu has been to see what's new to drive.
New foreign luxury models are among the almost 800 cars on display at the Beijing Auto Show, the first major international trade fair during the coronavirus pandemic. This year there are fewer exhibitors, but crowds still gathered for the unveiling of new models, including BMW's latest offering. The German car maker is one of many expanding operations in China.
All of us gathering at the world's largest automotive event here in China has all of a sudden become a very special meaning. The 2020 Beijing Motor Show is a symbol of hope.
Weak car sales in the US and across Europe have forced several international manufacturers to close factories and sack staff. Many are relying on Chinese consumers to improve their bottom line.
They realize China is still a gold mine. Luxury cars and ultra-luxury cars have a huge market in China. And this is also their only international arena to show off their vehicles. Other auto shows, Geneva, Detroit and Tokyo, have all been called off.
Analysts say the 10-day event points to the Chinese government's confidence in having contained the COVID-19 outbreak. It also hopes the auto show will help to spur the sluggish economy. China's auto industry is worth $1.3 trillion and employs more than 33 million people nationwide. Car sales plunged by almost 80% at the height of the epidemic in China in February, but sales have recently returned to pre-pandemic levels. Electric vehicles and cars using AI and internet technology are in the spotlight this year. By the year 2025, China's government wants 25% of all car sales here to be electric. So Chinese and international brands are racing to produce hybrid and electric models in order to meet government quotas.
The Chinese government is increasingly determined to invest in electric vehicle infrastructure. This is attracting more investments, creating a better market and more incentives for people to choose electric.
The Beijing Auto Show is being held against the backdrop of the trade war with the United States. Automakers Tesla, Ford and Volvo among companies suing the Trump administration this week for imposing what they say are unlawful 25% tariffs on imported Chinese parts.
Joining us from Beijing via Skype now is Thomas Ingenlath. He's the Chief Executive of Polestar, Volvo's electric sports cars division. Welcome to the show. They say electric cars are the future, so maybe we should start by asking you, what has Polestar been developing and what does it plan to put into production soon?
Well, Polestar has developed over the last 2.5 years electric cars. We are out with our electric Polestar 2, mid-size premium sedan, which we presented and are now bringing to market. But of course, we have a line upcoming that includes a really nice aerodynamic SUV addressing the electric age in the SUV sector. And we presented here in Beijing a car that was a show car, became a production car. And we are really happy that this very, very sporty, sleek, big saloon will hit the roads sometime in, let's say 3-4 years.
All right, exciting times ahead. But when it comes to range, is hydrogen a better solution to climate change? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, at the end of the day, it's about the electric drivetrain. The electric motor enables CO2-free mobility. If you source this with the battery or with hydrogen power, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. I think the best technology has to be in place. And at the moment, feeding it with batteries is the most appropriate way for the private sector. And I think the customers, the consumers need that confirmation. And us as car producers should give that confidence that this is a technology now for the next decade.
Well, talking about confidence, these haven't been the best of days for the auto industry thanks to the pandemic. Are sales now coming back?
Well, you see, for the electric brands, this does not matter as much as generally the trend of customers that bought ICE-train cars before trying electromobility and really shifting towards electromobility. That is a big gain for the electric car industry. And the general up and down of the economy and the car industry has less influence on that than the willingness and how much politicians prepare for people to move, people being really dedicated to, making the shift really happening, which everybody's talking about. But now it's time for action.
So it sounds like you could be saying electric cars could also be a way out of the crisis.
I definitely think that generally moving to green technology, embracing the innovation that is helping us all to stop climate change is definitely a way forward. You see that a lot of governments have similar thoughts and put support for the industry exactly into that sector, not going what we call back to normal. We don't want to go back to normal. We want to go back to the future. And that is about innovation in order to come to a sustainable life and industry.
And a final thought, how damaging has the trade dispute between the US and China been for the auto industry?
Well, I definitely believe that generally the uncertainty and the not knowing what is happening tomorrow, the tariffs definitely have a bad influence on the atmosphere, on the industry and consumers, what is happening tomorrow.
Investor sentiment as well, no doubt.
An industry which is so dependent on trade and the free flow of goods and cultures living and working together, it's absolutely counterproductive.
All right, it's been great getting your thoughts. Thanks so much for your time, Thomas Ingenlath.
Thanks a lot. Welcome.
And that's our show for this week. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.